Hello Year 7 and welcome to this first lesson from home. This is a pre-recorded lesson I'm recording from my classroom so that you can still follow the content of the lesson and also have access to a similar sort of style of lesson that you would normally get if you were in school. So we are going to carry on with My Sister Lives on the Mantelpiece as per our usual Wednesday lesson. And the point of this section of today's lesson is to understand how to explore Jamie's dilemma. Now, there's a brief task in the box at the bottom of this slide. If you've got a dilemma, what kind of position are you in? And an example of a dilemma is, for example, you know that somebody has robbed a bank, but then they've given that money to the poor. Okay, so think about Robin Hood type scenario. So this leaves you with the dilemma of, do you report the person to the police because they've done something wrong, or do you keep it quiet because you know that actually the money's going towards the poor? And a dilemma is kind of one of these things where you have to consider your options and come to a judgment based on what somebody has done. Okay, so today we're going to apply that to the novel to try and explore Jamie's dilemma. Now before we start, what I want you to do is have a think about what Jamie's dilemma might be at the moment. Okay, now throughout this video what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to pause at various points. Okay, at that point when you pause, I'll go quiet. You can do the task, you can make notes on it on paper or on the Word document, on the PowerPoint itself, which you'll be able to edit in Microsoft Teams. And then you can play it again afterwards, and I'll still be here talking after you've done the task. So the first task I'd like you to do before we start reading is I'd like you to consider what Jamie's dilemma is. Okay, so what I want you to do is to write down what you think Jamie's dilemma is, and also why is it a dilemma. Okay, remember that a dilemma is where you have to make decisions where the options involved will both result in some kind of impact or some kind of effect, detrimental effect. So if I go back, so in the Robin Hood scenario here, if you report Robin Hood to the if you report Robin Hood to the police, then you end up with Robin Hood in trouble. But if you don't report Robin Hood to the police, he still robbed the bank, if that makes sense, kind of thing. So yeah, have a go at that first task for me, and I'll stop talking and give you some time to do that now. So please pause the video and complete that task. Okay, so after you've done that task, and if you're struggling with that task, don't worry too much. I've put some pictures on the board to do with Jamie's dilemma. Now obviously, as we know so far, Jamie and Son, you've got a bit of a relationship going on. Jamie feels frustrated by the way that his dad sort of neglects him. Obviously, we know his dad's sort of reliance on alcohol. So Jamie's sort of got this dilemma. In essence, does he continue being loyal to Dad, and Dad's views about Muslims, or does he act in terms of Sonia's friend, and he has to make a decision as to which one he drops. And he, in his head, he can't have them both at the same time. He has to make a decision. Does he stay loyal to his dad and fit in with his dad's views on Muslims, or does he sort of go against Dad's views and choose to become Sonia's friend and continue that friendship? So we're now going to read, you're going to read a little bit of the book and read the next chapters that we're going to move on to. Now to do this, you'll need to go to this link below. The link is on the assignment section of Teams, and it's also on the Teams page. So if you click that link or copy and paste it, it'll bring you up a section of the book electronically, and you'll need to scroll down to get to that. Now what I'd like you to do independently, okay, and you can go at your own pace with this, I'd like you to read all of chapter 12 and then some of chapter 13 up to keeping them alive. And I've put a picture here at the bottom with an arrow to explain where I'd like you to read up to in chapter 13. Okay, so that's all of chapter 12 and then some of chapter 13. And I'd like you to pay attention to how Pitcher, the writer, depicts and explains and describes Jamie's moral dilemma to us. I'd like you to read chapter 12 and some of chapter 13 now, so you can pause the video and resume when you have finished. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now, after you've read the chapter, is I'd like you to answer those questions for me, please. What decision does Jamie have to make? And each decision will bring with it more follow-up decisions. So it's not like, for example, Jamie can just say to Dad that he's got a friend called Sonia who's a Muslim. It's not like he can just do that and then there be no repercussions and no impact from it. So every decision has some kind of impact with it. The second question, I'd like you to answer what follow-up decisions will have to be made. And I'd like you to do this in note form. It doesn't have to be a paragraph, it can be bullet points. In note form or in paragraph form, please. And I'd like you to do that now. It should take you between 3 and 5 minutes. You can pause the video now. Okay, so moving on to the next task, which will take up the bulk of the lesson time today. I'd like you to track out Jamie's options using what we call a decision tree. So a decision tree, if you have a look at the graph on the right, it starts at the very top with a decision that Jamie has to make, or that somebody has to make, and each sort of stick that comes off that decision is like each side of the decision. So for example, if the decision was, do I have any work to do? If the answer is yes, stay in and do it. If the answer is no, what's the weather outlook? Okay, if it's sunny, do this. If it's overcast, do this. If it's rainy, do this, and so on. Okay, so it's almost like a thought process, and what you'll do is you'll have to sort of track down both sides of the decision tree to sort of track out the kind of thoughts that Jamie and the kind of decisions that Jamie needs to make. I'd like you to pause the slideshow now and make your decision tree. This should take you about 10 minutes, okay, and it should start off like that, and you can do this on paper or you can do this electronically. On Microsoft Word you can do it by using the shapes function or just by using text boxes and arrows. Okay, if you pause the video now, you can then have 10 minutes to complete your decision tree. Okay, now what I'd like you to do after you've had a look at your decision tree, and hopefully you managed to complete that in detail, sort of as is the example, with as many additional levels and branches as you can. What I really wanted you to try and do was to think every level, all of the nitty-gritty, really sort of minuscule decisions that Jamie would have to make. I'd like you to answer these 3 questions for me. You don't have to write anything down, you can just think them through in your head, or think about what you would say if you were in the classroom and you put your hand up. Okay, how do you think Jamie is going to decide? You know, what thought process do you think he's going to go through? How should Jamie decide? What should he do? What should his decision be? And what process should he go through in terms of deciding? And then the final question, what would you do if you were Jamie? Okay, which do you think is the easiest option? Which do you think is the most difficult option? What would you do, taking into account sort of Jamie's age, taking into account Dad and Jazz, taking into account Sonia, and all of those things together? What would you do if you were Jamie? Okay, I want to give you a minute now to think through your answers to those questions. As I say, you can write them down if you want to, but you don't have to. You can just think them through in your head. Okay, so next we've got a little bit more reading of chapter 13. Okay, I'd like to continue reading chapter 13 up to I ran into the school to find Sonia. And what I want you to do whilst you're reading that is I want you to pay attention really carefully, please, as to how Jamie solves his dilemma and why he decides in this way. I want you to consider that last line there. I ran into the school to find Sonia. I want you to think about whether that line gives us a clue or not as to the decision that Jamie makes. Okay, I'd like to pause the video now and read some more of chapter 13 up to I ran into the school to find Sonia. Okay, now I'd like us to think about Jamie's decision. Okay, and I want you to kind of make it really clear in your head. How does Jamie decide, and why does he decide that? And I'd also then like you to consider, what decision does Sonia have to make? How is Sonia going to decide? Why is Sonia going to decide in that way? And there's no real right or wrong answers here. You need to use the evidence that's in the text to make a judgment. Obviously, the topic needs to stick firmly within My Sister Lived on the Mantelpiece, but what's really important is you've got to have a reason behind all of this. Okay, you can't just say, I said so, and that's why. You've got to be able to justify and come up with a reason for these. Have a think about those now. Again, you don't have to write anything down, but you can if you want to. These are kind of questions that I'd ask as a whole class, and I'd take feedback from people. So have a think about what you would say if you were in a lesson with me in school. You can pause now. Okay, then in terms of finishing up, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read the rest of chapter 13 from Find Sonia to the end of chapter 13, please. You can pause now. Sorry, I forgot that bit. Okay, so coming back to the point of today's lesson and this idea of dilemma, I hope you've been able to explore the idea of dilemma. I hope you have a clear understanding. If I go back to right at the start of the lesson, I hope you have a clear understanding of what Jamie's dilemma is. And if I talk you back through what we've done today, so we've considered what Jamie's dilemma might be. We've then considered and read all of chapter 12, some of chapter 13 to see how Jamie deals with his dilemma. We've thought about decisions. We've thought about the decision tree. You've produced your own decision tree to work out what Jamie's dilemma is and all the different strands of his dilemma. Okay. You've thought about how Jamie decided. You've read to the end of chapter 13 to explore how both Jamie and Sonia respond to their dilemma. Okay. So in tomorrow's lesson, we will proceed with my sister Liz on the mantelpiece. I'll just double check what I've got planned for tomorrow. And what we're going to do is we're going to consider the character of Sonia. So we've looked at Jamie's side today. Tomorrow we're going to consider the character of Sonia, and we're going to do a bit of thought tracking in terms of Sonia and Sonia's thinking during this chapter. Now, if you do have any questions during the session, if it's in lesson time, so if it's, for example, tomorrow period 4, when you would normally have me, I will be on Teams at that time for you to post questions in the chat box. Okay, so to do that, you just go onto the Teams page, and at the bottom you click New Conversation. Okay, I can't guarantee a response within 5-10 minutes, but I will have Teams open, and I'll make sure that I'm responding to any questions that you've got at any point during that time. Okay, thank you very much for listening.